If this story keeps you listening, subscribe and tell me what horror story I should tell next.
The first Marine off the ramp went in up to his knees and stopped moving. He did not stop because he was hit. Nothing was shooting. The whole beach was quiet in a way that men who had already done Tarawa and Peleliu recognized immediately as wrong. He stopped because the sand under his boots was not sand. It was pressed into a long, curving trough about 4 feet wide, slick with something that was not seawater. And the trough ran from the surf line up into the tree line, without breaking pattern once. Behind him, the coxswain of LCVP-26 killed the engine without being told. The rest of the stick, 5 Marines, 1 radio man, 1 flamethrower operator with his tanks still dry, came off the ramp in a staggered file, none, and stopped in the same trough for the same reason. Nobody spoke for about 11 seconds. 11 seconds is a long time on a hostile beach. The trough was not a shell furrow. Shell furrows have blast lips and scorched edges. This had neither. The sand along both sides of it was pushed up in even ridges, the way wet clay is pushed up alongside something heavy dragged across a table. Whatever had made it had been wide, low, and enormously heavy. And it had come out of the water and gone into the jungle without leaving a footprint on either side of itself. Sergeant Elwood Marek, senior man on the stick, told his people to hold. Then he told them, without turning around, to check the pattern in the sand about 6 feet to their left. The pattern to their left was a circle. A clean, wet circle about 18 inches across, pressed deep enough into the sand to hold standing water. 6 feet beyond it, another one. 6 feet beyond that, another. The circles ran parallel to the trough all the way up the beach, evenly spaced, each one identical in diameter, each one deep enough that a helmet would have fit inside it with room to spare. The radio man, PFC Cletus Bar, said the word suckers before he thought about it, and then he apologized for saying it because it did not sound like something a grown man should say on an operation. Nobody laughed. Marek told him to raise the ship and confirm they were on the correct beach. They were on the correct beach. Beach Yellow, southeast face of an island, the operation folder called Objective Ipava, a 2-mile hump of jungle and coral roughly 140 nautical miles off the main axis of advance, garrisoned per intelligence by a reinforced Japanese company with coastal guns and a seaplane mooring. The pre-landing bombardment had gone in for 40 minutes at first light. The destroyer USS Pharaon, hull number 478, was standing off at about 2,000 yards to provide call fire once the beach was declared. The beach had been declared at 0714. It was now 0731. There had been no return fire during the bombardment. There had been no return fire during the approach. There had been no small arms, no mortars, no machine guns from the ridge that the intelligence sketch had marked in red pencil as probable MG nest. There had been nothing at all. Just the trough and the circles and a smell along the surf line that was not the smell of a bombed beach. Marek moved his people off the drag mark. He put 2 riflemen on the flanks and told the flamethrower operator, Corporal Vince Delahoy, to stay center rear until told otherwise. Then he walked the trough up toward the tree line, alone, for about 40 yards. And then he stopped and looked at what the trough went to. The trough went to a Japanese pillbox. The pillbox was intact. The firing slit faced the sea. Inside the slit, the barrel of a Type 92 heavy machine gun was still resting on its mount, canted slightly upward, as if the gunner had lifted his head to look at something and then not come back to the sights. The belt was fed. The safety was off. There was no gunner. There was no assistant gunner. There was no ammunition bearer. There were 3 helmets on the floor of the pillbox, arranged in a rough line, and there was a smell inside the concrete that made Marek back out of the slit and put his sleeve across his face without meaning to. The trough ended at the rear door of the pillbox. The rear door was open. Something wet had gone in, and something wet had come out, and the pattern of the drag on the concrete floor suggested that whatever came out had been heavier on the return. Marek did not say any of that on the radio. He said that Beach Yellow was undefended, that the forward pillbox appeared abandoned, and that he was requesting the follow-on waves be held at the line of departure pending a sweep. The battalion operations officer aboard the transport asked him to clarify the word abandoned. Marek looked at the drag mark. He looked at the row of 18-inch circles running back down to the water. He looked at the destroyer Farron sitting on a flat gray sea under a sky that was beginning to bruise up in the east, and he chose the word again because he could not think of a better one. "Abandoned, sir," he said. "Recently. By 900 hours, 3 more sticks were ashore and the beach was officially under Marine control, though nobody used the phrase because there was nothing to control it against. Second Lieutenant Harlan Boyce brought the follow-on element up the trough line and stopped where Marek stopped, and stared at the pillbox for a full minute without going inside. Boyce had been on Guam. He had cleared 32 bunkers on Guam. He knew what a cleared bunker looked like from the outside, and he knew what a fought-over bunker looked like, and he had a private opinion, which he kept to himself for another hour, that this was neither. The intelligence sketch had marked 4 defensive positions along the southeast face. The Marines walked to each of them in turn. They found 4 intact positions with weapons still mounted, ammunition still stacked, water canteens still filled, and no personnel. In 2 of the positions, rice was still in the mess tins. In one of them, a cigarette had been stubbed out on the edge of a wooden crate, and the burn mark on the crate was fresh enough that Boyce touched the ash and looked at his fingertip, and did not say what he was thinking. The Garrison strength assessment had been 170 men. There were no bodies. There was no blood in any position that any Marine could find. There was no sign of withdrawal, no equipment cached, no documents burned, no demolitions set, no fighting positions collapsed. The Japanese did not leave positions like this. Nobody left positions like this. Positions like this were left by men who had gone to get water and never come back. At 0940, a rifle team under Corporal Ansel Pruitt reached the seaplane mooring on the north side of the small cove. The mooring float was intact. The aircraft was gone. The refueling drums were stacked and full. The maintenance shed was open, tools laid out on a bench in the order a mechanic uses when he's planning to come back after lunch. There was a logbook on the bench, open to a page dated 3 days prior with an entry written in Japanese, in a careful, unhurried hand. The last line of the entry was incomplete. The pen was on the floor next to the bench, uncapped, the ink dried in a small pool where it had landed. Pruitt sent the logbook back to the beach with a runner. The battalion interpreter, a Nisei staff sergeant named Kenji Fumihara, read the last entry twice before he translated it out loud. And even then he translated only the part before the break. The entry described a sound. It described a sound that had come from the water for 6 nights running, always after dark, always at the same tide. It described the sound as low, close, and moving parallel to the beach. The writer, identified in the log as Petty Officer 2nd Class Aoki, had noted that the pattern of the sound suggested something large following the reef line. He had also noted, in a phrase Fumihara translated twice to be certain, that 2 men from the seaward sentry post had failed to return from watch on the previous night, and that the post itself had been found undisturbed. Fumihara stopped translating there. Boyce asked him what the incomplete sentence at the bottom said. Fumihara looked at the page for a moment before he answered. He wrote, "It is closer today than it was." And then the pen stops, Fumihara said. Boyce did not ask what closer meant. He asked the runner where the logbook had come from. And when the runner said the maintenance shed by the mooring, Boyce told him to go back and tell Pruitt to withdraw the team from the mooring immediately and rejoin the beach perimeter. The runner asked whether he should give a reason. Boyce thought about that for a second and then said no. By 10:15, the beach was fully consolidated, and by 10:30, the battalion commander himself, Lieutenant Colonel Frank Reasoner, was ashore. Reasoner walked the trough line personally. He walked to the pillbox and looked inside without going in. He walked to the row of circles and crouched over one and touched the wet inside it with the tip of his glove, and looked at his glove for a long time. Then he called his company commanders together, in the shade of a bombed-out palm about 30 yards inland, and told them that the operation was proceeding as briefed. The island was to be secured. A defensive perimeter would be established by nightfall. Patrols would sweep the interior in the morning. Contact with the Farron would be maintained on the tactical net. One of the company commanders, Captain Elias Rood of Company G, asked whether the drag marks and the missing Garrison would be reported to task force in the noon situation report. Reasoner looked at Rood for what witnesses later described as an uncomfortable length of time. "Report them as consistent with pre-landing bombardment effects," Reasoner said. Rood did not argue. He walked back to his company. He passed the row of circles on the way, and he counted them. And he stopped counting at 43 because they went all the way to the surf line and disappeared into the water. And he did not want to know how many were under the water. The sea began to change at about 1400. It did not change dramatically. It changed the way a sick man's face changes across an afternoon, small pallor, a slight tightening, nothing you could point at. The swell out beyond the reef built by half a foot, then another half foot. The wind stayed light, but shifted 3 points east of where it had been at dawn. The sky in the east, which had been bruise-colored at first light, was now the color of an old lead pipe, and lower than it should have been for the hour. The Farron signaled that the barometric pressure was falling faster than the morning forecast had predicted, and requested guidance on standing off further to sea. Reasoner told him to hold station. Call fire coverage was required until the interior sweep was complete, and the interior sweep was not going to begin until the morning. The Farron skipper, Commander Ephraim Doust, acknowledged. He also, according to his own log, recovered later noted the time and the barometric reading and the fact that his sonar operator had reported an anomalous return at 1347, approximately 600 yards off the port beam, moving on a bearing that paralleled the beach. The return had been large, slow, and shallow, and the sonar operator had classified it initially as a whale. The sonar operator had then, at 1402, unclassified it. He had noted in his own hand that whales do not stop, reverse course, and pace a stationary ship for 15 minutes without surfacing. He had asked the officer of the deck to come to the sonar shack. The officer of the deck had come, had listened to the return on the headset, and had walked directly to the captain's cabin without speaking to anyone on the way. None of this was communicated to Reasoner on the beach. It was standard doctrine to hold ambiguous sonar contacts within the ship until they were resolved. Doust intended to resolve his contact by dusk. The contact resolved itself first. At 1438, PFC Bar on the beach radio picked up a fragment of transmission from the Farron on the tactical net that was not addressed to the beach. It was internal ship traffic that had bled through when a switch was thrown wrong somewhere on the destroyer's bridge. Barr later wrote down what he heard, from memory, in his notebook. The notebook survived. The relevant line reads, "It's under the keel, it's under the..." The transmission cut. Barr waited. The tactical net came back 30 seconds later on the correct channel, with the Farron's regular yeoman reading a routine weather update in a voice that Barr described in his notebook as flat and rehearsed. Barr walked the transcript over to Merrick. Merrick walked it over to Boyce. Boyce walked it over to Reasoner. Reasoner read it twice, folded it, put it in his breast pocket, and told Boyce to double the beach watch and to move the LCVPs off the sand into the shallows in case they needed to withdraw personnel to the transport. Boyce asked whether he should signal the Farron directly for clarification. Reasoner said no. He said the Farron's captain would signal them if he needed anything. The order to move the LCVPs was executed at 1500. The coxswains reported, in the process, that the water in the shallows was warmer than it had been at dawn by a measurable amount, and that a large volume of dead fish had accumulated along the eastern end of the cove, mackerel mostly, and a few small tuna, all intact, all fresh, all floating belly up in an even band about 10 yards wide that ran parallel to the reef. The fish had not been there at first light. They were there now. They had come up from below, together, and they had come up dead. The Corps men attached to Company G, Chief Pharmacist's mate Owen Halbeck, walked down to the eastern end of the cove and picked up one of the mackerel and turned it over in his hands. He was looking for shrapnel damage. He was looking for concussion trauma. He was looking for the kind of injury a depth charge or a bombardment would produce. He found none. The fish were structurally undamaged. Their eyes were clear, their gills were undistended. They were simply dead. And they had come up from a depth their bodies were not built to survive. And the only thing that brings a school of deep fish to the surface in one dead layer is a pressure event underneath them. Halbeck put the fish back in the water. He walked up the beach to Boyce and told him what the fish meant, in the plain clinical language corpsmen use when they do not want to be misunderstood. He said something large had come up under the school from below, and the school had died on the way up. Boyce asked him how large. Halbeck said he was not qualified to estimate. He said only that the affected band of dead fish was about 10 yards wide, and that whatever had displaced enough water to kill a band of fish 10 yards wide had been at least that wide itself. Boyce did not repeat that number to Reasoner. He wrote it in his notebook, and he underlined it twice, and he went to find Fumihara. Fumihara was in the maintenance shed by the seaplane mooring, going through the rest of Petty Officer Aoki's logbook. He had, by that point, translated 11 days of entries. The entries described, in careful ascending order, a garrison that had lost 14 men over 18 days without a single shot fired. The men had been lost in ones and twos, always at night, always from positions closest to the water. In 3 of the losses, equipment had been recovered at the site. In the others, nothing had been recovered at all, including the men. The garrison commander had initially attributed the losses to American reconnaissance activity. By the 9th day, he had stopped writing that. By the 11th day, according to Aoki's summary, the garrison had begun withdrawing all personnel from the seaward positions to interior positions after 1800 each night. On a rotation the officers referred to in the log as the Tide Watch. The Tide Watch had not saved anyone. The last 3 losses had come from interior positions. Fumihara showed the 11th day entry to Boyce. Boyce read it twice. Then he asked Fumihara whether the log contained any physical description of what the garrison had thought was taking their men. Fumihara said no. He said the log referred to it only by a single term, used consistently across the last 6 entries. He said the term did not translate cleanly. He said the closest English rendering was the one that comes up. Boyce closed the logbook. He handed it back to Fumihara. He walked back to the beach and he stood at the surf line for a while, and he watched the water. And the water was flat where it should have been rippling. And he understood, in the practical way an infantry officer understands things when he sees them, that his battalion was standing on a killing ground that had already been used. He did not go to Reasoner with this. He went to his own company commander, Captain Rood, and he told him. Rood listened. Rood did not interrupt. When Boyce was finished, Rood asked him one question. "How many of ours have we lost since we came ashore?" Boyce said none. Rood said, "Then we haven't been noticed yet." Dusk on objective Apava came fast because the storm was coming faster. By 1730, the eastern sky was black to the horizon, and lightning was walking sideways across the cloud base in long, silent branches. The wind had stiffened to a steady 20 knots out of the east-northeast, and the swell inside the cove was up to 3 feet, which was more than the reef should have allowed. The reef was doing its job. Something behind the reef was overpowering the reef. The Farron had, without further transmission on the tactical net, moved from her station 2,000 yards offshore to a new station about 1,200 yards offshore, closer to the beach. She had not requested permission to reposition. She had simply repositioned. Reasoner noted this in his log and did not challenge it. A destroyer captain who moves closer to a hostile shore in a rising storm is a destroyer captain who has made a decision he does not want to explain over the radio. The Marines dug in along a rough horseshoe with the open end facing the sea. 2 rifle companies formed the arc. Weapons companies formed the interior. And Reasoner's command post was set up about 80 yards inland in the lee of a coral outcrop. The beach itself, the sand between the arc and the water, was designated as a free fire zone after 1900. Nothing was expected to come out of the water, but nothing was expected to come out of the interior either. And the arc had to face something, and the interior had the coral for cover. The seaward-facing sentries were placed in pairs at 50-yard intervals along the arc. The pairs were rotated every 2 hours. The rotation began at 1800. At 2000, the second rotation went out. At 2200, when the third rotation went to relieve them, one of the pairs was not there. The post was Sentry Point 4 at the northern end of the arc, about 10 yards back from the surf line, dug into a shallow scrape behind a fallen palm. The 2 Marines assigned to it were PFC Manuel Escareno and PFC Dwight Loomis. Both men were experienced. Escareno had come through Saipan. Loomis was newer but had been steady through the landing. The relief pair, PFC's Booth and Yarrow, reached Sentry Point 4 at 22:03. They reported the scrape empty. They reported both rifles present, both helmets present, both canteens present, and one poncho arranged as if it had been rolled up and set aside rather than dropped. They reported no signs of struggle. They reported no blood. They reported that the sand behind the scrape, on the seaward side, was disturbed in a pattern that Booth, in his statement later, called smooth, like something wide had been laid across it and lifted back off. They also reported, and this is in both their statements, that the sand in front of the scrape between the scrape and the surf line contained 2 of the 18-inch circular impressions. The impressions had not been there at 2000 when the second rotation had gone out. Booth was certain of this because he had helped dig the scrape at 1700 and had walked the ground personally. The impressions were fresh. The edges were sharp. The bottoms were wet. Boyce came to Sentry Point 4 at 22:11. He looked at the scrape. He looked at the rifles. He looked at the 2 impressions in the sand. He measured the distance from the seaward impression to the water and got 11 feet. He measured the distance from the landward impression to the scrape and got 4 feet. 4 feet from the scrape. Something had come out of the water 11 feet, put a suction disc down 4 feet from 2 armed sentries, and taken both of them without disturbing their rifles, their helmets, their canteens, or the poncho one of them had folded before he was taken. Boyce did not report it as missing. He reported it as unaccounted for and requested that the arc be pulled back 30 yards from the surf line. Reasoner approved the pullback without asking why. The arc was pulled back at 22:30. At 22:47, a second sentry pair went quiet on the radio. This was Sentry Point 7 at the southern end of the arc, and it did not report in during its scheduled check. The relief for Sentry Point 7 was sent early. The relief found the scrape empty and the rifles present. This time the poncho was not folded. This time, on the seaward side of the scrape, there was a single drag trough about 4 feet wide, leading down to the water in a smooth, unbroken curve. The drag trough hadn't been there at the previous check. By 2300, Reasoner had ordered the entire beach arc pulled back another 40 yards, and had ordered every man in the perimeter to face outward toward the sea. He also, according to the operations log, requested that the Pharaon illuminate the beach with her 20-inch searchlights on a 2-minute cycle. The Pharaon did not respond to the request. The tactical net was open. Barr, on the beach radio, called the Pharaon 3 times in 8 minutes and got no response. On the 4th call, at 23:14, the Pharaon's radio man came back on the net with a voice that Barr later said was not the same radio man who had been on the net earlier in the day. The new voice acknowledged the searchlight request and said the request could not be complied with at the current time. When Barr asked why, the new voice said the searchlights were being held in reserve. Barr asked in reserve for what? The new voice did not answer. The net went quiet. Boyce, standing beside Barr at the command post, took the handset from him and held it for a moment without keying it. Then he handed it back and told Barr to log the exchange verbatim and to keep the net open on the Pharaon frequency at all times. Then he walked out to the pulled-back arc, and he stood behind Corporal Delahoy, the flamethrower operator, and he watched the water. The water was black. The lightning was in the clouds now, close and getting closer, and every few seconds the whole cove lit up in a pale, flat blue that made the surf look like poured metal. In one of those flashes, Boyce saw something he did not report until 3 days later. He saw, about 60 yards offshore, a low horizontal shape in the water that was longer than any of the LCVPs. The shape did not have a wake. The shape did not have running lights. The shape was moving parallel to the beach, from north to south, at approximately the same speed as a man walking. In the next flash, the shape was gone. Boyce did not tell Delahoy what he had seen. He told him to keep his pilot light burning and to keep his tanks pressurized. Delahoy said, "Yes, sir," and did not ask why. Behind them, along the whole length of the pulled-back arc, 640 Marines faced the sea and waited for a storm that was going to hit them from 2 directions. At 0:14, a Japanese soldier walked out of the jungle behind the Marine command post with his hands empty and his uniform soaked through. And he did not stop walking until PFC Cletus Barr put a rifle in his chest and told him to get on the ground. He got on the ground. He did not resist. He did not speak. Fumihara was called forward, and Fumihara knelt beside him in the wet sand and asked him his name and his unit. And the man did not answer either question. He answered a question he had not been asked instead. He said in Japanese that there were 9 of them left. He said they had been in the interior for 6 days. He said they were coming out now because they had run out of interior to go to. He said the thing in the water had begun coming inland after the American ships arrived, because the water was no longer enough for it. And he asked, in the same flat voice, whether the Americans would permit his group to remain on the beach until morning. Fumihara translated this to Boyce and to Reasoner, who had come up from the command post. Reasoner asked whether the man was armed. He was not. Reasoner asked whether the man was requesting surrender. Fumihara asked the man. The man said no. He said his group was not surrendering. He said his group was requesting to stand on the beach with the Americans until the tide turned. And after the tide turned, they would go back into the interior on their own. Reasoner asked him why the tide mattered. The man looked up at Reasoner for the first time. His face, in the flash of the lightning, was the face of a man who had not slept in a functional way in a long time, and who had been rationing that sleep against something specific. He said the thing came up on the rising tide. He said it went back on the falling tide. He said this had been true for as long as the Garrison had been on the island. And it had been true, according to the local fishermen the Garrison had questioned, before the fishermen also stopped being available, for a great deal longer than that. Reasoner asked how long a great deal longer than that meant. Fumihara asked. The man said something that Fumihara had to ask him to repeat. Then Fumihara translated it, carefully. The man had said, "Since before there were boats on this water." Reasoner did not respond to that. He gave an order instead. He ordered the man taken into the perimeter, disarmed if any weapon was found on him, treated as a temporary non-combatant, and asked to bring in the rest of his group under a white cloth. He also ordered the seaward arc reinforced with the reserve platoon, and he ordered every heavy weapon on the beach, the .30 cals, the .50 cals, the 260mm mortars retasked to fire on the water rather than on the interior. The Japanese soldier, whose name Fumihara eventually got, and who was a warrant officer named Ishida, watched all of this happen from a sitting position beside the command post with the same flat attention. When the reserve platoon began moving forward to the arc, Ishida spoke again, quietly to Fumihara. He said the guns would not matter. He said his garrison had fired on it twice, at close range, with a Type 92 heavy machine gun and with rifle grenades, and the rounds had gone into it and had not come out of it. And the thing had not slowed, and had not turned, and had not made any sound at all. He said the only thing that had ever made the thing turn was the presence of a larger animal in the water. And the only larger animal that had ever been in the water near this island was one that Ishida himself had seen once, from a distance, and had not been able to identify. Fumihara translated this too. Reasoner listened. Then Reasoner did something that the officers around him remembered clearly afterward, because it was out of character. He asked Ishida a question directly, without going through Fumihara for the phrasing. He asked, in English, "Is it intelligent?" Ishida understood the word. He nodded once. Then he said, in Japanese, a sentence that Fumihara translated as, "It knows where the food gathers. It knows when the food gathers. It waits until the food is close enough together to be worth coming up for." Reasoner looked out at the beach. He looked at 640 Marines dug in along a 200-yard arc, packed shoulder to shoulder in the pullback, backlit by the lightning against a black, wet sea. He did not need Fumihara to translate what he was looking at. The 8 remaining Japanese came in through the perimeter over the next 40 minutes, singly, each of them carrying no weapon and no equipment except a canteen. They were placed in a shallow depression, about 15 yards behind the command post, and given water and told to remain there. None of them spoke unless spoken to. All of them faced the sea. At 1:20, the storm hit the beach. It hit the way tropical storms in that part of the Pacific hit, not with a single front, but with a folding over of air and water into one continuous wet weight. The rain came sideways. The wind went from 20 knots to 50 knots inside 4 minutes. 2 of the LCVPs, which had been anchored in the shallows, broke their moorings and were carried up onto the beach and dumped there like tin cans. The palms behind the perimeter began going down in 2s and 3s, roots and all, and the sound of them going down was completely swallowed by the sound of the surf. The surf was the wrong sound now. The surf was not breaking on the reef anymore. The surf was breaking on the beach, which meant the swell had climbed over the reef, which meant something had displaced enough water inside the cove to lift the sea over its own barrier. At 1:41, the Farron fired her first flare. The flare went up from the destroyer's foredeck at a low angle and burned white against the black cloud base for about 11 seconds before the wind took it out to sea. In those 11 seconds, every Marine on the ark saw the same thing. They saw the Farron, 1,200 yards offshore, listing about 15 degrees to starboard. They saw the water around the Farron moving in a way that water does not move. It was not moving with the storm. It was moving against the storm, in a broad, slow rotation about 150 yards across, and the rotation was centered on the destroyer. And they saw, rising out of the water on the far side of the destroyer, something that in the 11 seconds of flare light, none of them could fully process, because it was too large to be a thing and too articulated to be a wave. Then the flare went out, and the beach went black again. And PFC Cletus Bar, on the beach radio, heard the Farron's tactical net open one last time. The voice on the net was Commander Doust's own voice. It was calm. Barr wrote this down twice in his notebook because he wanted to be sure. The voice was calm. Doust said, "Beach, this is Farron. We have contact port side, close aboard, large, illuminating." Then he said without pause, "Beach, be advised. Contact is..." The transmission stopped there. It did not cut. Barr was firm on this in every statement he ever gave afterward. The transmission did not cut. It stopped in the middle of the sentence, in the middle of the word. The carrier wave remained open for another 6 seconds. In those 6 seconds, Barr heard distinctly on the open channel a sound he described in his notebook as the sound of a very large amount of water moving very quickly through a small space. Then the carrier wave closed, and the Farron's 20-inch searchlights came on together. Both of them, at full intensity, aimed straight up. The searchlights of a Fletcher-class destroyer are visible from 20 miles away in clear weather. In the storm, at 1,200 yards, they cut 2 solid white columns through the rain and into the base of the cloud. And they held there, motionless, aimed straight up, which is not a direction any destroyer searchlight is ever aimed on purpose. They were aimed up because the platform underneath them was no longer level. Every Marine on the Ark turned to look. Nobody gave the order. 640 men turned toward the sea at the same time, and Boyce, standing behind Delahoy, saw the whole Ark turn as one motion, like a wheat field going over in a wind. In the light of the 2 upward columns, the Farron was silhouetted against her own reflected glow off the cloud base. She was listing now at what Boyce later estimated as 35 degrees to starboard, and her bow was coming up out of the water at an angle that was not possible for a 2,000-ton warship in 180 feet of water. Her bow was coming up because something was lifting it. The thing that was lifting it was visible now, in the ambient wash of the searchlights wrapped around the destroyer's hull from the waterline forward. It was black, and it was wet, and it was thicker at its base than the destroyer's own beam, which meant it was, at its base, wider than a 15-foot-tall building. It tapered as it climbed the ship, but it tapered slowly, and where it crossed the number 478 painted in white on the destroyer's bow, it was still thicker than a mature palm trunk. Along the underside of it, in the wash of the light, the Marines could see the suction discs. They were arranged in a double row. Each disc was the size of a helmet, and they went all the way up the length of the thing, and there were hundreds of them, and the ones closest to the destroyer's hull were compressed against the steel so tightly that the steel around them was already beginning to buckle inward. A second column of the same material was already breaking the surface on the far side of the destroyer. It came up in a slow, deliberate arc, dripping a wall of white water off itself, and it laid across the destroyer's afterdeck the way a man lays an arm across a table. Where it touched the deck bent. And then, between the 2 columns, the head came up. Nobody on the beach used the word head at the time. They used the word it, or the word thing, or in the case of Sergeant Merrick, who was standing at the northern end of the Ark with his rifle at low ready. No word at all. But it was a head. It broke the surface between the 2 rising columns of tentacle, and it kept coming up. And it did not stop coming up until the top of it was higher than the destroyer's forward gun mount. The head was as large as a house. Barr, in his notebook, wrote the phrase "size of the barracks building at Paris Island," and then crossed it out and wrote larger. The skin of it was black and slick and scarred and covered in patches of what looked like barnacles and long fronds of dark growth that hung off it in ropes. Along the front of it, arranged not in a pair but in a cluster of 4, were eyes. The eyes were amber. They were the color of a kerosene lamp seen through smoke. Each of them was the size of a truck tire. Each of them was open. And each of them, in the wash of the Farron's own searchlight bouncing off the cloud base, was turned not toward the destroyer, but toward the beach, toward the Ark, toward the 640 Marines who were standing in a curved line in the wet sand with their weapons pointed at the water. Boyce, behind Delahoy, felt the flamethrower operator's shoulders go rigid under his hands. He had not realized he had put his hands on Delahoy's shoulders. He took them off. He said quietly, "Do not fire." And he said it not to Delahoy, but to the whole Ark. In the parade ground voice he had been taught at Quantico for use when a formation was about to make a mistake. Nobody fired. Nobody moved. The rain came down at a slant, and the wind pulled at their ponchos, and the beach was lit blue-white every 4 or 5 seconds by the lightning above them. And the 4 amber eyes offshore looked at them, and the Ark looked back, and nothing happened for what Boyce afterward estimated as 11 seconds, and what Barr afterward estimated as closer to 30. Then the thing decided the beach was not what it had come up for, or it decided the beach could wait, or it decided something else that no man on the Ark was ever going to know the shape of, because the 4 amber eyes moved in unison back to the destroyer, and the destroyer came apart. It came apart in a way that ships do not come apart under gunfire or under torpedo strike. It came apart slowly, along the length of its keel, as the 2 tentacles wrapped around it flexed in opposite directions and folded the ship the way a man folds a piece of tin. The hull plates screamed. That was the word every Marine on the Ark used afterwards, screamed. The steel of a destroyer, being folded, screams. The forward gun mount broke free of its mounting bolts and slid down the tilting deck and went into the water. The bridge tower buckled at its base and pitched forward. The 2 searchlights, still burning, swung down out of the vertical and swept once across the cloud base and once across the sea and once across the beach. A single, long, slow pass that lit 640 Marines white against the sand for a full 2 seconds and then went dark. The head sank first. It went down without hurry, the 4 amber eyes still open, still oriented forward. The tentacles followed, unwinding themselves from the wreck with the same slow deliberation with which they had wound. The last thing to go under was the section of the destroyer's bow with the painted number 478. And it went under stern first, because there was no longer any stern. The sea closed. The rain kept coming. The Farron, or what had been the Farron, was gone at 1:53 by Barr's log. There were no survivors from the ship. There was no debris field for the first 11 minutes. When the debris did come up, it came up in a tight cluster about 400 yards inshore of where the ship had gone down, which meant it had been carried there, underwater, by something moving toward the beach. The debris cluster stopped about 200 yards offshore. It stopped there, and it did not move any further. Boyce, on the Ark, understood what the debris cluster meant. He understood that the thing had brought the wreckage of the ship to a position from which the beach could be reached in one motion, and had then let the wreckage go, and had gone somewhere else to wait. He turned to Delahoy. He said, "Douse your pilot." Delahoy said, "Sir?" Boyce said, "Douse it now. No flame, no light. Nothing on this Ark that gives off light. Pass the word." The word went down the Ark in both directions. Every flashlight was killed. Every cigarette was ground out. The 2 60mm mortar crews unloaded their tubes and covered the muzzles. The command post lantern went out. The Japanese in the depression behind the command post, who had not moved through any of it, remained facing the sea in the dark. The beach went black. And in the black, 640 Marines and 9 Japanese soldiers stood together, facing the same water, and waited for the tide to turn. The tide was supposed to turn at 3:11. Fumihara had gotten the time from Warrant Officer Ishida. who had gotten it from the Garrison's tide table, which had been kept accurately for the 11 months the Garrison had been on the island. Ishida was confident in the time. He said the tide on this island was regular to within 4 minutes. He said this had also been true, according to the fishermen, for a great deal longer than the Garrison had been keeping the table. At 3:11, the tide did not turn. At 3:20, it did not turn. At 3:35, it did not turn. At 3:47, Boyce walked down to the surf line, alone. And he stood there with his boots in the wash, and he watched the water come up over them and stay there. And he understood, in a practical way, that the tide was not going to turn until the thing offshore decided it was going to turn. The thing offshore had not left. The debris cluster was still at 200 yards. Every 11 or 12 minutes, the surf pattern along the whole cove changed briefly, a small ripple of pressure moving across the reef line from east to west and then back again. And each ripple came a little closer to the beach than the last one. It was pacing. Boyce went back up the beach, and he went to Reasoner. And he told Reasoner what he thought was happening. Reasoner listened. Reasoner had been listening a lot in the last 3 hours. Reasoner had not spoken more than 20 words since the Farron went under. When Boyce was finished, Reasoner asked him one question. "What does the Japanese say?" Boyce went and got Ishida. Ishida came to the command post in the dark with Fumihara beside him, and he sat down across from Reasoner in the wet sand. Reasoner asked, through Fumihara, whether the tide had ever failed to turn before. Ishida said yes. Once. He said it had happened on the night the Garrison had lost the pillbox on Beach Yellow. He said the tide had held for 6 hours that night, and the thing had come up onto the beach 3 times, and after the 3rd time, the Garrison had stopped counting the men who were missing. Reasoner asked what had ended it. Ishida thought about this for a moment. Then he said, through Fumihara, that nothing had ended it. He said the thing had simply gone away when it was finished, and the tide had turned about 40 minutes after it had gone away, and the Garrison had come out of the interior at dawn, and had found the beach empty of everything the thing had come up for. Reasoner asked what the thing had come up for. Ishida looked at him. Fumihara translated the question. Ishida did not answer immediately. When he answered in English, not in Japanese. His English was clean and unhurried, and he had clearly been holding it in reserve for a reason. He said, "Whatever was on the beach." Reasoner nodded once. He did not say anything else. He looked down at the map spread across his knees in the dark, though he could not see it, and he ran his thumb along the eastern edge of Objective Ipava, where the reef line was marked in blue pencil. Then he said, without looking up, "Boyce, get the LCVPs off the beach." Boyce said, "Sir, in this swell they won't clear the reef." Reasoner said, "I'm aware." Boyce said, "Sir, if we put men in those boats now, we're putting them in the water." Reasoner looked up. In the dark, Boyce could not see his face. He could only hear his voice, which was very even. Reasoner said, "The alternative is leaving them on this beach." Boyce did not answer. He walked back down the arc. He went to Marek, and he went to Rude, and he went to the coxswains. And he passed the order, and the order was received the way orders like that are received, without argument and without visible reaction, because the men receiving it had already done the same math their commander had done. The first LCVP went into the water at 0402. It carried the wounded. There were 4 wounded. From the storm, and from a fallen palm that had come down on a fighting position at 0230. And it carried the battalion surgeon, and it carried 3 coxswains, and it carried chief pharmacist's mate Halbeck, who had volunteered without being asked. It carried no weapons because Reasoner had ordered no weapons in the boats. He had ordered the boats to be as quiet as possible. He had ordered the coxswains to run at half throttle until they were clear of the cove. The LCVP made it 80 yards off the beach. At 80 yards, the water underneath it changed. The coxswain, a boatswain's mate named Ridley, later said in his statement that the boat lifted, all at once, about 4 feet without pitching or rolling. It lifted straight up on a rising surface of water. The surface held the boat for about 2 seconds. Then the surface tilted, very slightly, to port, and the boat slid off it. The boat did not capsize. It slid sideways off the surface, and it hit the water again on its port side, and Ridley kept the throttle open and drove it back toward the beach on a curve. And he made it back to the sand with all 4 wounded and all 3 coxswains and the surgeon and Halbeck still aboard. Halbeck was the first one out. He did not stop when his boots hit the sand. He walked past Boyce without speaking, and he did not stop until he was inside the perimeter and behind the coral outcrop. The second LCVP did not go into the water. Boyce canceled the order himself before it was launched, and Reasoner did not overrule him. At 0420, the debris cluster began to move. It moved slowly at first, from 200 yards to 180. Then from 180 to 140. It did not move on the swell. It moved against the swell, which meant something under it was pushing it, and the thing pushing it was coming to the beach. At 140 yards, the debris cluster stopped again. It stopped there for a very long time. Nothing on the beach spoke. Nothing on the beach moved. Barr, at the radio, had the handset in his hand and had not keyed it in over an hour. The tactical net had been silent since the Farron went down. At 0447, the tactical net opened. There was a voice on it. Barr, in his statement, was clear that the voice was not any voice he had heard before. It was not doused. It was not the Farron's regular radio man. It was not the second radio man who had come on the net at 2314. It was a voice, human-sounding, calm, that came through the handset in English, and it said one sentence. The sentence was, "Beach, be advised, contact is," and then the voice stopped. In the middle of the sentence, in the middle of the word, exactly as Dost's transmission had stopped at 153. The carrier wave remained open for 6 seconds. In those 6 seconds, Barr, holding the handset to his ear, heard what he had heard the first time, the sound of a very large amount of water moving very quickly through a small space. Then the carrier wave closed. Barr set the handset down. He did not pick it up again for the rest of the night. He did not, in the 3 years he continued to serve in the Marine Corps before his discharge in 1947, ever pick up a radio handset again. At the surf line, in the dark, at 140 yards, the debris cluster began to move again. It came to 60 yards, then to 40. Then it stopped at 30. At 30 yards, the debris cluster spread apart, slowly, into a wide, flat ring, and the water inside the ring went smooth. It went smooth in a way that water in a storm cannot go smooth on its own. It went smooth because something underneath it was holding it flat. Boyce, on the ark, waited for the first tentacle to come up out of the flat ring. It did not come up. The flat ring held. The rain kept coming down onto it. The lightning kept coming down out of the cloud base. And nothing came up. For 11 minutes, nothing came up. At 0514, the flat ring collapsed. The debris in it dispersed on the swell. The pressure ripple along the reef line stopped. And at 0519, the tide turned. It turned all at once, the way Ishida had said it would once it began to turn. And within 12 minutes, the water was 6 inches lower against the beach and falling. The wind eased. The rain kept coming, but the rain was rain now, not a weight. The eastern sky began to gray at the edge, and by 0547 there was enough light on the beach to see the ark, and to see the wreckage of the 2 grounded LCVPs, and to see, along the surf line, the fresh row of 18-inch circular impressions. The impressions ran the length of the arc. They came in at 30 yards offshore, tracked parallel to the beach at that distance for 200 yards, and went back out on the eastern end of the cove. They did not come up onto the sand this time. But they had come, and they had held station across from the arc for 11 minutes, and they had gone. Boyce walked the line. He counted the impressions where they were closest to the beach. He got to 63 before he stopped counting. Halbeck came out from behind the coral outcrop at 6:02 and walked down to the surf and looked at the impressions and did not say anything. Marek walked down beside him. Marek said quietly, "Why didn't it come up?" Halbeck said, "It wasn't hungry." Marek said, "It just ate a destroyer." Halbeck said, "That's what I mean." The two men stood there for a while. Then Halbeck said something that Marek later wrote down in the small green notebook he kept in his breast pocket, which is how the sentence survived. Halbeck said, "The Garrison lost 14 men in 18 days. That's how much it takes. It got a whole ship last night. It's not coming back tonight. It's not coming back for a long time." Marek said, "How long?" Halbeck did not answer. He walked back up the beach. At 700, Riesener gave the order to re-embark the battalion. It took most of the day. The LCVPs were run in relays across a sea that was flat and cooperative and empty. No sonar contact was recorded by any vessel in the task force during the re-embarkation. No man was lost during the re-embarkation. The 9 Japanese, including Warrant Officer Ishida, were re-embarked with the Marines and treated as prisoners of war and transferred, on arrival at the fleet anchorage, to a naval intelligence detachment that took custody of them within an hour of their arrival, and about which no further record survives in the operational file. Objective Ipava was declared secured at 18:30 that evening and abandoned the following morning. The island was not garrisoned. It was not used as a staging point. It was not fortified. The operational plan that had called for its use as a forward airstrip was quietly revised at task force level, and the island was bypassed for the remainder of the campaign, and it was not visited by any American vessel again during the war. The loss of USS Farron was reported in the after-action summary as consistent with catastrophic storm damage in high seas. The sonar contact log was not attached to the summary. The tactical net transcript was classified at 5th Fleet level and sealed. Commander Doust and his crew of 273 were listed as lost at sea, cause weather. The 2 Marines missing from Sentry Point 4 and the 2 Marines missing from Sentry Point 7 were listed as lost at sea, cause storm. Their families received the standard letter. The letter did not mention that no body was recovered, because no body was expected to be recovered from a storm loss. The circular impressions on the beach were not photographed. The drag mark to the pillbox was not photographed. Petty Officer Aoki's logbook was taken into custody by the Naval Intelligence Detachment along with the Japanese prisoners, and it does not appear in any subsequently declassified archive that has been reviewed to date. The one document from Objective Ipava that survives in the open record is a single-page addendum to the after-action report, filed by 2nd Lieutenant Harlan Boyce and countersigned by Captain Elias Rood. The addendum is 1 paragraph long. It reads, "The garrison of Objective Ipava was not present when the landing force arrived. Physical evidence on Beach Yellow indicates the garrison was lost prior to the landing to a cause not consistent with combat action or environmental hazard as currently defined in 5th Fleet doctrine. The undersigned recommend that Objective Ipava be removed from the list of contested territories and not be revisited by naval or amphibious elements of this command. The undersigned further recommend that the surviving members of the Japanese garrison be interviewed by qualified personnel prior to any operational disposition being made of them. The undersigned decline, at this time, to speculate as to the nature of the cause referenced above." The addendum was received. It was filed. It was not acted upon in any way that appears in the record. Objective Ipava was, in fact, removed from the list of contested territories. But the reason given in the removal order was administrative, no longer of operational value, and the addendum was not cited. Boyce survived the war. He did not speak publicly about Objective Apava in his lifetime. His personal papers, donated to a state historical society by his family in 1994, contain a sealed envelope marked in his own hand with the words, "Beach Yellow, October 22nd, 1944. My own account." The envelope, as of the last catalog review, is still sealed. The Historical Society's policy is that it will remain sealed until 50 years after the death of the last surviving member of the battalion. The last surviving member of the battalion is no longer known to be alive. The island, on modern navigational charts, is unnamed. It is marked with a small notation in the fine print at the base of the chart that reads, "Anchorage not recommended. Local conditions." The notation has been on the chart since 1952. It has been reviewed for removal 3 times. Each time, it has been retained. Nobody in the chart office is entirely sure why. The file that would explain it is missing from the archive. It is one of a small number of Pacific Theater files that are missing from the archive. And the pattern of what is missing, the Farron's sonar log, Aoki's translated logbook, the disposition record for the 9 Japanese prisoners, the photographs that were never taken, is a pattern only if you already know to look for it. If you do not know to look for it, the file is simply not there, and the notation on the chart is simply a caution, and the island is simply an anchorage that is not recommended, and the water around it is simply water. The suction impressions in the sand were 63 that Boyce counted. He stopped counting at 63. The row ran the length of the arc and off the eastern end of the cove and into the water, and the row went down on the falling tide to wherever the row went down to. Whatever the row went down to is still there. It has not been hungry for a long time. The chart still warns against the anchorage. The manuals still route shipping around it. And somewhere in a state historical society in the American Midwest, in a sealed envelope in a climate-controlled archive box, a Marine second lieutenant's own account of the night of October 22nd, 1944, is waiting for a reader who is not yet permitted to open it. The tide on that island turns on time now. It has turned on time every night since. That is not the same thing as safety. That is only the same thing as patience.